Outlaw, overcome, overseas. Ownership, owns package. Pain, Pakistan.
This is a country which from the early 1950s onwards has been ruled by people who have totally thrown themselves and abased themselves before American power and before the United States of America. And it is this that has made the country what it is. So sometimes people say to me, oh, but you guys on the left, you're always blaming the Americans. No, I'm not just blaming them, I'm blaming the Pakistani collaborators, the rich, the privileged, who have collaborated with the United States for their own reasons and for their own interests. Each has tried to use the other, and the result has been that the country is in a terrible state. It is this country's tragedy that it's trapped between military dictatorship and political corruption.
You say that you're surprised as to the fact that the Pakistani population, the mass Pakistani population, isn't more attracted to the jihadi kind of way of doing things.
They aren't. And the reason they aren't is they have their problems. I mean, you have an astonishing figure, actually it's an obscene figure, which is that 60% of kids born in Pakistan are being born stunted.
Yeah, this malnutrition.
Malnutrition is,
Right,
is creating this. And, you know, for me that's a crime. You have massive poverty, you have food shortages, you have people just fighting for their lives, and on the top are corrupt politicians who think that all is well. But you know, the tragedy of Pakistan is that it has been the military which has ruled the country for more than half its life. Why? Because of the United States.
If you want a state on your side like Pakistan, even if it is the war you're fighting is fictitious in so many ways, why do you start bombing an area that was generally unaligned in that sense to the Taliban? Surely you're going to, and also one of the fears that's always expressed, oh, we don't want a jihadist on the, with his finger on the button in Pakistan. And yet this incursion seems designed, or is inevitably going to destabilise. Is this rational?
The time the Pakistani intelligence services created jihadi Islam, backed it, funded it, trained it, was when the United States wanted that. Because at the time the Russians had occupied Afghanistan and the Americans wanted to drive them out and they needed allies, and the allies they created were the jihadis. A lot of the books that were used as jihadi catechisms, primers, were published by the University of Nebraska. A lot of these people were taken to the deserts in Nevada and trained in Arizona. Train how to use Stinger missiles, train how to blow up places. The army is now being told to go and kill its own people in the northwest frontier region, and that is also creating mayhem.
See, the Pashtuns, I think I'm right in saying, were kind of unaligned before. They were kind of semi-independent.
No, they were never semi-independent. They were part of Pakistan.
No, I don't mean in terms of the territory. I mean in terms of their outlook. They were not Talibanized.
No. They were quite hostile, the Pashtuns, to the form taken by the first Taliban in Afghanistan.
Right.
Because Pashtun Islam, for the Pashtuns, was a relatively soft affair. It wasn't a Wahhabi Islam on the Saudi model. That was quite alien to the people and they didn't like it. And as a result of it, the Taliban itself has begun to change, because the people who are fighting the NATO armies in Afghanistan, which are referred to in the British media certainly as the neo-Taliban, are essentially people who include the old Taliban, but lots and lots of new people who don't like being occupied. And these are the people with whom the West has now begun to negotiate and talk.
This is odd though when you think about what happened in Iraq. It seems to be like recent history repeating itself, because the American forces have had to make deals.
Iraq is a complete, it's crazy, and worse even than the craziness that goes on there. Over 1 million Iraqis have died. 2.5 million refugees, the social infrastructure completely wrecked, and the politicians who did it are still ruling us. And they've got away with murder.
Well, it almost feels like it's come off the agenda now. This is what
They don't talk about it.
It's incredible.
I think what people have to understand is that Obama will be the president of an imperial state. He will want to show the American military that he's a tough leader. So I think he will essentially do what the US military wants him to do, which is better than the neocons, because there were elements inside the US military who were not in favor of the adventure in Iraq. So in terms of Afghanistan, where Obama's had a very hawkish position, and on which he didn't disagree
on
with
Pakistan
us,
too.
on Pakistan and Afghanistan, a lot will depend on what the US military want.
Do you think that you could say that an America which is economically contracting will be less adventurous in in the area of foreign policy?
I'm not sure about that. Whenever a country is weak economically, an imperial country, it often becomes more adventurous and uses its military strength to make up for its economic weaknesses. And so I think we have to be more worried and more alert about the American military machine, that they might go in for adventures which are unacceptable. So it's not the case that shortage of funds will impede them, because they'll say we have to get more funds. So keep an eye on our rivals. And the rivals which they are most fearful of are China, Japan, the Korean Peninsula, the whole Far Eastern Bloc. And one reason some of the NATO ideologues give for being in Afghanistan is that it's important for us to have bases on China's borders.
Right.
Now, this may be fantasy, but that is certainly what many of them argue. So they're capable of adventures, but I think they will backfire. That is the thing. The thing that people want is a national health service. Because with the economic crisis, even fewer people will be able to afford to get basic medical treatment. And it's an outrage that the world's largest and most powerful country has a disgusting, shocking health service.
40 million people not covered?
Not covered. And if you
At
don't
all?
have, no. And if you don't have money, you can be left to die on the streets. We want the social infrastructure of this country restored. And that should be the demand, both here and in the States. It's very interesting that the German politicians are now beginning to say, even conservative German politicians, thank God we didn't go down the road they wanted us to, the Anglo-Saxon people. They were attacking us, the Financial Times, the Economist. The Germans are not reforming enough. Reforms mean privatize.
Okay, and specifically, any advice for the Stop the War movement?
You know, when I was in New York, when the crash happened, there were people in Wall Street dressed like millionaires after the bailout, young people, and saying, thanks, Bush, for bailing us out. Could we have another 4 billion tomorrow? Just very incredibly funny placards. Or a famous placard which other demonstrators carried saying, why don't you jump, you bastards? So, you know, this sort of way of operating in the anti-war movement has to be thought up instead of the rituals.
You're talking about more cultural imagination.
More cultural. And
Well, this doesn't surprise me coming from yourself, because one thing I wanted to come back with, as a musician as well myself, is that you were actually... You saw that interface right up close in the 60s with your relations with John Lennon in particular, and in a way you were almost like between Jagger and Lennon at one point. I remember.
I thought Jagger's music was more radical in many ways.
Well, it hasn't turned out quite that way.
No, it didn't turn out that. Lennon became more radical later. But in '68, Jagger was much more radical. John Lennon admitted that when I discussed this with him. He said, you know, the reason we didn't come on the Vietnam marches is because our manager said, if you go on those big anti-war demos, you'll never be allowed into the United States and we'll suffer financially. And he said, one of my biggest regrets is that I believe
listening to that.
Yeah. But I think we have to do things think of more imaginative ways of doing things and building new movements and new organizations which are not just a repeat of the past. People are fed up with all that.
Get ready for a new kind of riot. A new breed of people around the